Oh, yes, you can hear me. Ah, very nice. You clapped early, though. You don't know what I'm going to say. You maybe be better if I didn't have a microphone. That's always a consideration as well. So I wanted to come up with a title that was a bit intriguing. And so before I tell you why I'm making you make this decision, I want you to think for a moment, which do you prefer, jazz or classical? Venkat has already told me that he prefers country, so he's no longer allowed to be in this keynote. I'm going to have to ask him to leave. So my name is Scott Davis. We're actually going to be talking about Java and JavaScript here, but sometimes these can be so emotional issues, such sensitive issues, that we can talk about other things. For instance, when I was in school, I was definitely a jazz player. I played trombone, bass trombone in the jazz band for years. But my wife, I married her, she played flute in the classical symphony. So as you're thinking about jazz versus classical, realize that it is entirely possible for people to get along, yes? If you don't. I'm a programmer, obviously. My wife is a project manager. And we managed to get along just fine, have two beautiful kids. So my son thinks he wants to be a programmer. And I told him, if you play your cards right, your dad was a programmer, your mother was a project manager, you will rule the world if you learn well from both of us. It's easy to come up with arbitrary decisions that we have to make, like jazz versus classical or things like that, because we're programmers here. Let me turn around and ask you, how many of you are programmers here? Yes, of course, you're at a software conference, yes? And so you're familiar with the bit, right? The binary digit, the fundamental building block of what we do. A bit is either 0 or what? True or false, yes or no, black or white. You get the idea, right? And what's so wonderful about this, it's why our job is so easy as a computer programmer, because everything boils down to a simple yes or no answer, right? Oh, rats. Well, perhaps this is closer to what the real world looks like. Sliders. And as much as we think that these light bulbs will always be all the way on or always be all the way off, the reality of the matter is it's going to be in an almost infinite number of states between those two extremes. It's easy to think about life in terms of extremes, in terms of the simple yes-no answers, but those simple yes-no answers very rarely reflect the reality of the situation. The reality is almost certainly more difficult, more nuanced than a simple yes or no answer. But this yes-no answer, this bit, this binary digit, can lead to some interesting thinking. Because notice now, as we're beginning to talk about dichotomies, this isn't one data point, but this is a whole number of data points. And the whole point of a dichotomy is that these must be mutually exclusive. That everything must either be in that purple dot or it must be outside of that dot. They must be jointly exhaustive and mutually exclusive. And do you see what they say right after that? They say such a pattern is also frequently referred to as bipartisan. We just went through a presidential election in the United States. Were you aware of this? I won't be talking about the results of the presidential election in the United States, but bipartisan is a good way of explaining it, isn't it? And it's a good way of explaining the elections in Turkey, and France, and Britain, and India, and a lot of different places. Politicians live to convince you that not just one of their arguments, but all of their arguments are correct. And their opponent's argument, not just one argument, but all of their opponent's arguments are incorrect. That's why when we talk about dichotomies do exist, but they're vanishingly rare. And so more often than not, we talk about false dichotomies rather than dichotomies, right? Because we live in a situation where we think it's either all good or all bad, and that's how we try to frame our arguments. My dear friend Neil Ford describes this as the sucks-rocks dichotomy, which is a little bit coarse language, but it does a good job of explaining what we're talking about here, right? That if you have a false dichotomy, and notice how we're paraphrasing this, or how we're predicating this, we're starting with a false dichotomy. Very often what happens next is that false dichotomy leads to I rock and you suck. This can be dangerous, can't it? This can be dangerous. Is this a dichotomy? It depends, doesn't it? Venkat extends vegetarian. That's a dichotomy for him, isn't it? When he's trying to decide dinner, he has a hard decision. He wants to make sure that that non-veg exception doesn't get thrown very often, right? I don't extend vegetarian. I implement vegetarianable, which opens up to a whole host of different opportunities for me, right? So when we get into arguments like this, and certainly it's not an argument with Venkat and I, whenever I'm in India, I eat veg with him all the time. When he's in the United States, I bring him to steakhouses all the time because that means I get to eat his steak and drink all of his whiskey. It works out perfectly. It works out perfectly. It's a perfect relationship, isn't it? Yes. But what we have to realize is sometimes we have to decide if it's a dichotomy in the first place or not. And we have to do that in a respectful way. And I know that's hard these days because we like thinking in terms of binary terms. We like thinking in terms of dichotomies. But it's in fact harder and more important to embrace our differences as much as we embrace our similarities. Because what's a dichotomy to some people is not a dichotomy at all. For instance, we're here talking about Java and JavaScript. Yes? What I love about JavaScript is most of what I do in JavaScript is a compiler error in Java. Yes? I mean, JavaScript is a dynamic language, so I constantly make calls to methods that don't exist. I refer to fields that may or may not be there. As a Java developer, that has to be so maddening. Can't he see the problems that this is going to cause? ... if I was a Java developer. Yes? One language's syntax error is another language's feature. And we need to be able to appreciate that. So when it comes to dichotomies, it's important to not only, when you have a dichotomy, but it's also important to recognize when you don't have a dichotomy. Because I don't consider myself a Java programmer any more than I consider myself a JavaScript programmer or Groovy programmer or anything else. Those are all false dichotomies right there. I'm a programmer that implements Java and Groovy and JavaScript and on and on and on. So we're here to talk about Java and JavaScript, right? And so that's why when I was thinking of the title for this, I thought, what are two other false dichotomies? What are two other things that would be easy for us to kind of consider, but something that wouldn't be so emotional and dear to us that our emotions would cloud the discussions? I chose two fairly arbitrary but fairly non-popular musical genres, jazz and classical, because I didn't think it would come to fistfights and gunfire, right, if we had to decide who felt more strongly about classical versus jazz. Does anyone feel so strongly that they feel they might be moved to violence in the next 45 minutes? Or is it safe to proceed? Yeah? Good. Well, what I would like to do then if you don't listen to a lot of jazz, think for a moment about what jazz evokes in your mind or what it means. Where's jazz played? Who is it played by? What are the type of people who listen to jazz? Under what circumstances do they listen to jazz? I'm kind of envisioning a dark, smoky bar, 2 or 3 in the morning, drinking illegal alcohol, right? Unkept musicians, sweaty musicians up on stage, but having a wonderful time. Yes? Well, let's take for a moment now and think about what a classical situation would be. What does that evoke in your mind? Does it invoke a dark, smoky bar? Or maybe an opera house? Does it invoke untucked pants? Or does it invoke tuxedos and ties? Yeah, it's a very different kind of music, isn't it? They're both music, but very different kinds of music. So as we're talking about jazz and classical, we're also talking about Java and JavaScript as well. So be thinking in your mind which of those 2 musical styles, jazz or classical, will stand in as a proxy for a given language. Think for a moment now about how you feel about Java. Yeah, classical. How do you feel about JavaScript? Probably jazz. Okay, all right. That's not surprising. That's what I expected. So let's evaluate these 2 musical styles, or programming languages, based on a couple of very emotional ideas. We're not going to talk about strong typing versus dynamic typing or compiled versus interpreted or things like that. Let's do a more emotional, subjective evaluation of these things. Which type of music do you feel is more respectable? Do you feel classical is more respectable or Java? Think to yourself, that's fine. Which type of programming language do you think is more respectable? Do you think Java is the more respectable one of the bunch or JavaScript? Well, this is the gentleman who invented Java, James Gosling. Look at him. Long hair, unshaven, wears a t-shirt all the time. Does he feel like someone who would write a classical bit of music? Yeah? Well, how about this guy? This is Brendan Eich, the father of Java. Look at him in a sports jacket. His shirt's probably tucked in. Oh, you know that you can never trust a programmer with their shirt tucked in, right? Never trust a programmer with their shirt tucked in. Venkat's pulling his shirt out as quickly as he can. So now wait a second. This is the guy who wrote JavaScript, and this is the guy who wrote Java? I'm beginning to think that choosing my programming language based on the length of the hair of the language originator is not a good idea. Would you agree with me? Yeah? How else could we evaluate the worthiness of these languages? Maybe by how old the originators are. Okay, James Gosling, born in 1955. Brendan Eich, born in 1961. No, that's not a real clear, easy way to think about that. Maybe if we're trying to think about the respectability of these languages, maybe how long the languages have been around. Maybe if one language has been around longer than the other, then by default, ipso facto, it might be more respectable than the other. Does that sound reasonable? Yeah? Except rats. This is the official history of Java from Oracle, from Sun, and they said 1995 was a big year for us. And it wasn't because of Windows 95. And it wasn't because that was the year I got married to my wife. That wasn't it either. They said, yeah, Java was introduced to the world in 1995. And do you know how Java was introduced to the world in 1995? In a little web browser named Netscape Navigator. Do you know what else was introduced in 1995 in Netscape Navigator 2.0? A little language called JavaScript. In fact, Java and JavaScript were popularly introduced to the world on the same day in the same piece of software, Netscape Navigator. Now, it's interesting. This is Brendan Eich. He's talking about this. He's like, when I was working on this language, Netscape specifically hired him to come in and add a programming language to the browser. Didn't have one up to this point. And so he was working on something. It was called Mocha for a little bit. It was called LiveScript for a while. And then out of nowhere, management kind of had a golf course deal with this other company, Sun Microsystems. And then all of a sudden, his programming language named LiveScript was in fact called JavaScript. This is interesting, isn't it? Because not only did these two languages come out on the same day in the same product, they were named almost the same thing. Now we know that this is a lie. The name is the first thing that breaks every Java developer's heart, doesn't it? Because there is nothing Java-like in JavaScript. Nothing at all. They're two totally different languages. And yet we have this thing called JavaScript sitting right next to this other thing called Java in the same piece of software that was introduced on the same day. We're trying to figure out which of these languages we should respect more. And remember, this is a dichotomy, so you can only respect one language. One language deserves all the respect, and the other language deserves none of the respect. So let's look at the heritage of Java. Java was based strongly on C and C++. How many of you are C developers in here? Yeah, some hands go up. How many of you are Java developers in here? You see the similarities, don't you? Yeah. I mean, the way we deal with if statements and for loops and all manner of things, all those control structures came directly from C. Now, what didn't come from C are some of the things that Java was trying to fix. One of the things that was very difficult in C was direct memory management. If you had an array and you were walking through the array, it was trivially easy to walk off the end of that array, right? Just kind of keep walking and getting garbage values in there. C was an incredibly powerful language, but it was an incredibly dangerous language as well. And of course, C++ came along and made that all better, right? Bjorn Strostrup, the originator of the C++ language, said, in C, it's very easy to shoot yourself in the foot. In C++, we made it harder. But when you do, you blow off your whole leg. So Java was actually C plus equals 2 at that point, right? Java was trying to fix all the things that C++ was trying to fix as well. That's why we have safe array navigation, we have safe memory access, we have all kinds of good things like that. But there's nothing wrong with basing yourself based on C and trying to present yourself as a better C than C. So JavaScript now. JavaScript, they say, although there are strong outward, superficial similarities between Java and JavaScript, starting with the name. Have you heard the old joke that Java is to JavaScript as ham is to hamster? Yeah. They're as similar as Java and JavaScript are. Yes, ham and hamster. So, but at any rate, we see despite these superficial outward similarities, the two are distinct languages and differ greatly in their design. Brendan Eich was actually hired by Netscape to bring a Lisp to the browser. He was using a language called Scheme. And so imagine how different our world would be right now if we were writing Lisp in the browser. We wouldn't need ClojureScript anymore, right? Because we would just be using Lisp. He was also strongly influenced by a Smalltalk called Self. And so we have one language that comes from a very strong Lisp Smalltalk background. We've got another language that comes from a very strong C background. I'd say both of those are very respectable, but certainly different. Brendan Eich, when he's explaining about this JavaScript transition, he said management came to me and they said JavaScript had to look like Java, but it kind of had to be Java's dumb kid brother. Right? There was some pressure from management to make the syntax look like Java, but not too much like Java. You've probably been in this situation before, right? Management came to them and said specifically, we want JavaScript to look exactly like Java, but you can't use classes. That's a neat trick, isn't it? What can you do in Java that doesn't involve a class? Not much. If statements, for loops, switch cases. So those same control structures that came from C into Java are the one overlap in that Venn diagram that JavaScript, by design explicitly, uses the same control structures as Java. But it misses what's arguably the most important thing of Java, is that it's object-oriented. We know that JavaScript, the base unit of measurement, is the function, not the class, right? So imagine being in a situation when your boss comes to you and says, it's very important, I need you to make some chicken tikka marsala. Okay, great. But you can't use chicken or masala. But otherwise, I want you to make chicken tikka masala exactly like I love it, because my mom made a wonderful chicken tikka masala. That's an unwinnable proposition, isn't it? Yeah. So let me introduce you to a third gentleman, Lars Bak. Has anyone heard of Lars Bak before? No hands go up. Everyone knew James Gosling. Everyone knew Brendan Eich. Brendan Eich invented JavaScript. James Gosling invented Java. Lars Bak is currently the lead on the V8 JavaScript engine. And he's an interesting fella, because V8 is an interesting thing. You know, we have one JVM that we really deal with, and that's the one that comes from Oracle. Yeah? Of course, there are other JVMs floating around. IBM writes its own and some other ones like that. But I mean, that's the mainstream one. That's the one that everyone expects. V8 is an open source JavaScript engine, incredibly well written. So well written, in fact, that not only does it power Chrome, the browser, but it's the same JavaScript engine used in CouchDB. It's the same JavaScript engine used in MongoDB. It's the same JavaScript engine used in Node.js. So we see that this is an incredibly popular piece of software, an incredibly well-engineered piece of software as well, that's used all over the place. And this is not an unsophisticated bit of software. This is software that's been around for a decade at this point. And V8 compiles JavaScript directly to native machine code. It doesn't use an intermediate bytecode. It doesn't read from the file system or anything like that. It's incredibly well engineered, fast. It does a lot of amazing optimizations, JIT optimizations in JavaScript. Now, these are all things that might sound like I'm describing the Java runtime, right? Because we all know the Java runtime is incredibly sophisticated as well. It does many of these kinds of things. It's surprising to a lot of people that JavaScript shows the same level of sophistication. Well, our good friend Lars Bak, when he started at university, he wrote himself a virtual machine for self. Do you remember self? I mentioned it earlier. That was one of the languages that influenced Brendan Eich, self as a Smalltalk. So at university, he wrote himself a Smalltalk virtual machine. At university, I drank my body weight in beer, yeah? And he wrote virtual machines. So that's why, you know, he is where he is, and I'm doing this, yes? But after he wrote that virtual machine for Smalltalk, he got hired by Sun Microsystems and went to work on a virtual machine project there. And in fact, was active in the JVM for a lot of years. We all know about the Hotspot compiler that came around in 1.2 that was a dramatic performance increase. That Hotspot edition was Lars Bak. So what did he do after he created a Smalltalk VM and dramatically improved the performance of the Java VM? He went to work for Google and created the JavaScript VM called V8. There's a lot of sophistication that goes on in JavaScript handling these days that I don't think folks appreciate. It's easy to appreciate the level of sophistication and the thousands or millions of hours that went into engineering the JVM. But sometimes we forget that there are other projects of equal length and durability. So, we were trying to decide which language was more respectable. Remember, only one can be respectable. The other one has to be disrespectful, because that is our rule of false dichotomies. Just like you can only enjoy classical, or you can only enjoy jazz, you can't enjoy both. All right, well, maybe that isn't enough for you to decide which language is the best. So let's look in terms of popularity now. Which musical style do you think is more popular, jazz or classical? Neither is an answer I get an awful lot. I'm fine with that as well, yeah. Which programming language do you think is more popular, Java or JavaScript? Let's see if we can put some numbers behind this. So if we go back to Wikipedia once again, as of 2016, Java is one of the most popular programming languages out there right now, with a reported 9 million developers. Feels like we've got at least 1 million of them in this room right here, don't we? Yeah? So 9 million is kind of an interesting number. That's a big number. Yeah? And then this is the survey results from the IEEE survey. So they surveyed quite a number of countries. I think they surveyed something ridiculous like 90 different countries, and they come to all these countries, and there we go. All right, well, there we go. There's our language ranking. They said in the fine print that Java has been #1 for the past 2 years running, and for this year, for some reason, C just overrode that just a little bit. So this is pretty straightforward then. 9 million Java developers. Java's #1 or 2 on the list. Look, JavaScript's all the way down at #8, so this is a done deal, right? Should we move on to the next topic? Oh, wait. Seems like Stack Overflow released a survey, and they claim that JavaScript is the #1 language, and Java's down there at #3, and C is down there at #8. Now, these are two surveys released by two very respectable organizations. One has C at #1 and JavaScript at #8, and the other has those roles reversed. What does that tell us? Who are we to believe? Well, it's hard to make decisions like this without a denominator, isn't it? These are percentages, but we don't know percentages of what. These are fractions, but we don't know what the total number are. So it's hard to come up with an exact number of programmers, but this is that same survey I was talking about before. 90 different countries. This was produced by IDC, respected organization. They claim that there are about 11 million software professionals. And as you look at different numbers, this is plus or minus right in that ballpark. So about 11 million developers. So 9 million of them are Java developers, right? So that leaves the other 2 million to be JavaScript developers. Does that math work? What? No? It's not that simple, is it? Because this survey not only recognizes 11 million professional developers, they recognize almost the same number, 7.5 million hobbyists. Oh, I thought for sure this was going to be an easy one. They're just numbers, right? How hard can it be to figure out which numbers are? We were just laughing about writing a bubble sort algorithm. Call array.sort and be done with this, right? Not so easy. So a professional developer, people who are engaged in gainful employment. So apparently to be a professional, you have to be employed. All right, I'll buy that. Where the primary activity is the construction of software or the direct supervision thereof. That seems like a reasonable definition. What about a hobbyist? Someone who sits on the couch, eats cheese doodles, plays Xbox. No, that's not it, is it? But it kind of feels like that description, doesn't it? You know, maybe they're working, maybe they're not. Maybe they're students, maybe they're not. They might be unemployed, maybe they're not. It's a tougher description. But the reason why I'm coming up with this professional hobbyist distinction is because all of a sudden we have a wonderful chart here that is about as far from a binary digit as we can get, isn't it? Remember the chart of the dichotomy where we had the pink circle right there, the purple circle, and the gray background, and it was either or, it was one or the other. Look at this chart now as they're trying to describe what this looks like. The blue circle is total skilled software developers, and out of that only a portion are professional. But notice over here we've got total software developers because some fall into the student categories, and notice student falls into professional and non-professional. We have hobbyists as well, and this is a far less satisfying chart, isn't it? This requires nuance and subtlety and overlap, and maybe the same developer could both be a hobbyist and a professional. We want simple, easy answers, don't we? That's difficult. Well, at the time Netscape was incorporating Java into the mix, they were having these same kind of discussions. And as a matter of fact, they were very explicit. They said, why do we even bother having two programming languages? Why don't we just incorporate Java and call it done? And they said, no, really, we want to have one language for the professionals. That's Java. Yeah, the component developers. And we want to have one language for the non-professionals. So it's interesting that this bias that we've held all these years isn't something we came up with. It, in fact, was given to us as the primary explanation for why we have two languages instead of one in that browser in the first place. So let's look at a couple more numbers here, try to determine which one's more popular. This is a number I like. This is the number of new packages released just in a given week, 1 week in January. In NPM, which is JavaScript, there are over 400 new packages released in just a week. That's a lot of packages. That's a lot of packages. For Maven, there are only 75 packages in that same week. So let's put on our false dichotomy pants for a moment here, and let's argue that same number in either direction. Maybe I could argue that JavaScript is far more popular because it's got over 4 times the new software development that Java does. Does that sound reasonable? What's a Java developer going to say in response? But they're a bunch of amateurs writing that code. There might be 400 libraries, but that's nothing you want to use, right? We've got fewer libraries, but they are professional grade. Yeah? So it's hard with numbers. I would think both of those arguments have elements of truth in them. Not a false dichotomy. It's hard when you agree with both sides of the argument, isn't it? But one last thing. If we're trying to gauge popularity and respectability, universities, for the longest time, have been teaching Java as their computer science 101. Stanford announced just recently, right, within the past week or so, that they are dropping Java as their CS 101 course and using JavaScript instead. Found that really interesting. But what I found even more interesting about this is when they surveyed all the universities, Do you know which one of those languages is taught more often than the other? Is Java taught more often than JavaScript, or is JavaScript taught more often than Java? It's a trick question. Python is the one that's taught more than both of them. Do you see what false dichotomies can do to you? I'm mean, aren't I? I apologize about that. So, popularity. If you can't choose the programming language based on the length of the developer's hair, maybe we could choose which one's more popular. Which one do you feel won that race? It's difficult, isn't it? And every time I'm asking you this question at the end of a section, I hope you're feeling the ambiguity there. That's my point. I don't want you to come to the end and say, oh, Scott, thank you, made it so clear that Java is clearly the most popular. Right? The whole point of this is to confuse you and befuddle you, right? Because that's what we do when we're keynote speakers. So, if we can't decide which language to use based on popularity, and we can't choose which language to use based on respectability, standards. Standards. And I love this. As a musician, when my wife talked about a standard, a classical standard, right? You know, she's, in her mind, she says, this is a standard because when Beethoven played it, you know, back in the 1800s, dun, 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 right? And I played it in the 1980s, dun, 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 dun. And then my son played it in 2017, dun, 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 dun. It sounded exactly the same every time, didn't it? Isn't that wonderful? That's what standards mean, yeah? What do you know about jazz standards? A jazz standard, and you're going to think I'm making a joke. I'm dead serious. The whole point of playing a jazz standard is to play it as differently as possible as you can from the last time you heard it. The whole fundamental premise of jazz is that you're going to improvise, yes? And so when you're playing a song, you might play the opening chorus or the opening few kinds of chords, but then as you're playing that jazz standard, your stated goal is to make it as different as possible from every other version of that song ever played. How are we going to agree on something as simple as standards when we have such vastly different definitions of what that means? Luckily, software is much easier, right? Now, Java, early on in its career, was going to be standardized by a non-partisan third-party organization, ECMA. ECMA is the European Computer Manufacturers Association. If you know ECMA, it's because you know the other programming language I'm going to mention in just a few slides, right? But let me be very clear, Java was going to be standardized by ECMA. In fact, they didn't. They turned around, and it is a pseudo-democracy, much like America. Oh, I was going to go into politics, and I did, right? But a pseudo-democracy, now Java has a benevolent dictator, yes? But he's a nice guy. I like Brian quite a bit. I'm actually going to go on holiday with him next week, as a matter of fact. Incredibly nice guy. Never play poker with him. Never play poker with him. He carries 2 wallets with him. One is full of money, and one is full of gambling certificates. The only problem is I only have one wallet, and he takes all the gambling certificates out of my wallet and puts it into his wallet. Yes? But Brian Getz is the lead architect. And so when we talk about standard versions of Java, it's what you would expect standards to mean. That we have a very regular release cycle every couple of years. We talk about what's going to be coming down the pipeline early. We release early betas so you can experiment with that feature. And then, boom. When 1.8 ships, you can begin using that feature in production because you know that it's been in beta and tested and proven. The version release, when it comes to Java, is almost the finish line, isn't it? It's all the work has been done, you can begin using it now. How does that work in JavaScript? It works exactly the same except everything is different. Yeah? It's kind of like Wikipedia. When I explain to people what Wikipedia is, oh, it's a website. Oh, great, I understand what a website is. Yeah, but what's interesting is this is a website that anyone can edit. What do you mean anyone? I mean everyone. You mean everyone can edit this? Absolutely. And it works? Yes. The amazing thing about Wikipedia is that it only works in practice. It doesn't work in theory, right? If anyone sat down and said, Scott, I've got a great plan. I'd put a website out there. All right, I'm with you. And we're going to let everyone in the world edit it. No, you lost me there. Yeah? But yet, Wikipedia is incredibly popular. It's one of the top websites visited regularly. So how does standardization work in JavaScript land? Well, let's go back to 1995 once again, when both JavaScript and Java were in that same web browser, Netscape Navigator. About that same time period, Microsoft tried to fork the JVM. Microsoft had their own version of the Java virtual machine that they were writing. It was licensed through Sun, but they were doing the software development, and they started adding Microsoft-specific hooks in. The same kind of, event handling you might do in VB, you could then do in JavaScript. And it doesn't sound like a bad idea when you begin. It's like, Windows developers, maybe they'd prefer the Windows event model versus the Java event model, and so they could begin using that. And that's fine as long as Java only runs on Windows. But what happens if you've got a Java developer who used the window event system and picked up that jar and dropped it onto a Linux box? Would you expect that code to still work? No. And who would you blame? Would you blame Windows for your code breaking or Linux? Probably Linux. Yeah? So Sun actually sued Microsoft, said that's not okay. This fork that you're trying to create in the community would actually be detrimental and it would hurt the life and the prospects of Java as a viable platform. And Sun won the lawsuit. About the same time, Microsoft said there's this really popular web browser out there called Netscape Navigator. We're going to create one of our own called IE. And since IE came about a year after Netscape Navigator also had this programming language in it called JavaScript. So Microsoft went to add JavaScript into IE. There was only one problem. Do you know who owned the trademark on the name Java? Sun. Do you know who Sun allowed to use the name Java when they were naming JavaScript? Netscape Navigator. Do you know who they didn't allow to use the name JavaScript? Because they were busy suing them in court, yeah? Microsoft. So when Microsoft released IE, they had to do a clean room implementation of JavaScript, and they couldn't even call it JavaScript. They had to call it JScript. But immediately, the code base forked. Immediately, there were some features that you could do in JScript that you couldn't do in JavaScript. There are some features you can do in Netscape Navigator you couldn't do in IE. If you were a web developer at the time, you remember that. Those were painful times. Those were not good times to be a JavaScript developer. So what happened then? That same year, 1996, Netscape took JavaScript to ECMA, the same organization that James Gosling took Java to. Only this time ECMA said, yes, we will standardize this language. Because Java in JavaScript was trademarked, this new standard language couldn't be named JavaScript. So they named it ECMAScript. Maybe one of the worst names of a programming language ever, yeah? Sounds like a skin disease. Oh, I got a bad case of the ECMAScript. Yeah? Put some calamine lotion on it, you'll be fine. Yeah. So ECMAScript is our standard version of Java. And what's interesting is that ECMAScript has a number of different variants, not even illegal variants, legal variants. ECMAScript, we know JavaScript is one implementation, ActionScript is in fact another. How many of you did Flex development back in the day? Flash, ActionScript, yes. It was very JavaScript-like, wasn't it? But it wasn't JavaScript. So what we have here is a language that has different variants on purpose. That's the whole point of this. And it's nice because there have been 7 releases of JavaScript since 1995. There have been 8 releases of Java since 1995. And both have been moving along at that same pace every couple of years, releasing new features. There was a bit of a hiccup in JavaScript land. At about 1999, we had standardized on ES3. And ES3 is basically Internet Explorer 6. So when everyone was trying to make their websites run in IE6, they were basically writing ES3. What happened, though, is the people on this standards body weren't just one person like Brian Getz. We didn't have a benevolent dictator. We had folks from Netscape on this board. We had folks from Microsoft. We had folks from Google. We had folks from a number of different organizations. And in a democratic process like that, sometimes not everyone agrees. And that was the story with ES4. ES4 was so contentious that they said, we choose not to release a new version of JavaScript because we just can't agree on it. So JavaScript went from 1999 to 2009 without a major release. Does that mean JavaScript is dead? No, because that same era is the era of Google Maps, is the era of Ajax, is the era of all of this innovation going on in JavaScript. But what we figured out is that we didn't have to wait for innovations to come from the language itself. Due to the dynamic language nature of JavaScript, due to the fact that we can add new methods dynamically on the fly, we can add new fields, we can manipulate the environment at runtime, it meant that we had 10 years of innovation that simply didn't come from ECMAScript. It was innovation from jQuery. It was innovation from Angular. It was innovation from Backbone and all these other JavaScript libraries. Profoundly influential, but third party. But when ES5 came back around again, they said, oh, we're going to start taking these features from all these different libraries out here. Now, the W3C said this about HTML, about JavaScript, but it's such a beautiful analogy, I'm going to use it anyway. The W3C said about HTML5, they said, our job is to pave over the cow paths. Look what web developers are already doing right now. And the way they're already doing it right now is through third-party libraries. So we're going to look at the ecosystem, we're going to look at the landscape, and as we figure out what popular features from these third-party libraries that everyone is using, we're going to turn around then and incorporate that into the core language. We're going to standardize after the fact instead of before the fact. And while this may sound chaotic, much like Wikipedia, this sounds like something that could only work in theory, never in practice. In fact, it does work in practice. Because innovation is able to happen as quickly as one browser manufacturer thinks of something. Remember that whole Ajax revolution we were talking about in 2005? Do you know who created the first Ajax implementation? IE, Microsoft. Microsoft, in their online exchange, their web portal for Microsoft Exchange, their mail client at the time, they said rather than doing these coarse-grained, whole-page requests and responses, if we've got an email app, wouldn't it be nice if you could be looking at one message and have your inbox spawn a separate thread and constantly be pulling for new messages when you're doing something else? It was a brilliant innovation. And when Microsoft came up with it, the folks at Netscape said, that's a great idea. And they turned around and implemented it in a mutually incompatible way. But they implemented it, and then by the time a third browser implemented it and a fourth, that's when the standard body looks and says, oh, this Ajax, it's a pretty good idea. Now that we have at least 2 or 3 reference implementations out there, we're going to look at what all they're doing. We're going to cherry pick the best features, and what becomes standardized is truly the best of breed. Is that story better or worse than the way Java is standardized? It's one of those questions I don't expect you to answer. It is different. And in fact, I can see strengths in both strategies. Because ES6 was a major release, included lots of new features. Angular 2 ended up leveraging a number of those features. But you know what else? They said there's some new things coming down the pike in ES7 that we can't wait for, specifically annotations. Only in JavaScript land, we couldn't call them annotations. That would make life too easy, wouldn't it? We have to call them class decorators. But these annotations arose by any other name. Yes, these class decorators are an ES7 feature. But you're writing Angular right now, right? So how is Angular right now taking advantage of some future release? That would be like you sitting down right now and trying to program against a Java 1.9 release, yeah? Or even better, a 1.10 or a 1.11. That would be madness in Java land, but in JavaScript, they absolutely did it. They said, yeah, we'll cherry pick that feature and this feature and this feature. And people say, well, aren't you worried that maybe it's implemented in Chrome but not IE, or maybe it's implemented in Firefox but not Safari? Aren't you worried about these kinds of things? They said, no. There are lots of different JavaScript engines out there. I mean, a lot, right? These are just the big 4 right here. SpiderMonkey is the JavaScript engine that comes from Mozilla. That's the JavaScript engine in Firefox. Did you know that it's also the JavaScript engine in Adobe Acrobat? So any automation you do in Adobe is done in JavaScript using SpiderMonkey. Did you know that SpiderMonkey is actually included in the JDK? Now, it's not named SpiderMonkey. It's named Rhino. Yeah. And do you know what the newer version of Rhino is, the one that came in Java 1.8? Nashorn. Do any of you sprechen Sie Deutsch? Nashorn is German for rhino, and rhino is English for spider monkey. What? No, that doesn't work out. But in fact, SpiderMonkey is the JavaScript engine that ships with the JDK. We've talked about V8. V8 is in Chrome, is in Node, is in Opera, is in MarkLogic, is in MongoDB, is in CouchDB. We've got Nitro, which is in Desktop Safari and Mobile Safari. We've got Chakra, which is in Microsoft Edge. Are we worried about standardization? Well, we are. We can see all of those JavaScript engines support features out of the 2006 spec or the 2017 spec, right? All of them are now competing as quickly as they can to implement these features, as fast as they can implement these features. They want to have the best implementation of this. So we're no longer in a situation where Microsoft and Firefox are running as far away from each other as they can. All of these browser manufacturers, specifically JavaScript engine manufacturers, are running as quickly as they can towards the same goal. But I told you this is just the short list. The list goes on. There's Nashorn, there's Rhino, there's ActionScript, there's all kinds of other things going on. The list continues to go on and on and on like this. Now again, as a Java developer, this has got to be giving you the shakes right now, doesn't it? Because the way Java solves Wara, write once, run anywhere, is they really control the platform. And that's a good way to do it. JavaScript can't possibly do that. We have so many different JavaScript engines written by so many different manufacturers. I say this is more like going out and buying a TV. Are you outraged that your Sony TV has the power button in a different place than your Samsung TV? Are you incensed that Samsung put the button here and Panasonic put the button there and Sony put the button there and LG put the button there? If you are, you're probably a Java developer, right? Yeah. Because a JavaScript developer would be like, yeah, of course they're inconsistent. Our whole world is inconsistent. I know there's a power button, but what if there's not a power button? What if someone shipped me a television that didn't have a power button on it? Oh, no worries. All I'll do is just polyfill a power button in, right? Because again, if a language feature that you want to use doesn't ship in Java 1.9, what are your options? Call Brian Getz. That's one, yeah, or wait. In JavaScript, if that feature doesn't exist, we simply polyfill it in. And when I first heard the word polyfill, I was so excited. I thought it was a big, important computer science word. It sounded to me like they were polymorphically backfilling this functionality. And doesn't that sound reasonable? I like my definition of the word polyfill much better than the real definition. Do you know what the real definition of polyfill is? Spackle. Yeah. What do you do when you punch a hole in the wall and you want to cover that wall up? You spackle over it. You polyfill over it. What do you do if your television doesn't ship with a power button? You polyfill over it. What do you do if IE supports Ajax and Netscape doesn't? You polyfill it. So you can see this is a very natural, very idiomatic way to deal with the inconsistency of all those different platforms. We don't let the inconsistencies stop us. We embrace the inconsistencies, and we've got another perfectly valid way to get around it. So, who wins the standardization battle there, Java or JavaScript? Someone said Java. You have not been paying attention, have you? I'm going to have to start over at the very beginning just because of you. No, of course not. We said that, yes, binary digits are really important to us, but they're really important to us in a vanishingly narrow scope of decisions. Our reality is really much more this than this, right? And when we're thinking about languages, it's very easy to fall into this dichotomy mindset that these are all of the features I love about this language. These are all of the features I hate about this language. Therefore, one must rock, one must suck. There is no other option, is there? Or is there? I can tell you honestly, I was there in 1996 when Netscape Navigator came out. That was when I first became a Java developer. That was when I first became a JavaScript developer. I was 26 years old. I was the very start of my career, and I saw the promise of the web, and I saw the strengths of both of these languages. And they were not equal languages, and they were not replaceable options. Each language had strengths. Each language had weaknesses and drawbacks. But how did I, as a developer, overcome that? Not by choosing one over the other. Not by creating a false dichotomy or a dichotomy that doesn't exist. In fact, I learned both languages. And I learned many more after that. Because I like Java, but there are sometimes I like Groovy more. Yeah? I like JavaScript, but there are some times where I like TypeScript more. Yes? So we're in an era right now where you should not be narrowing your choices, but broadening them. Because dichotomies don't exist when it comes to programming languages. Much like dichotomies don't exist when it comes to music. Did you enjoy yourself? I did as well. Thank you so much for your time and attention.